Hello and welcome to UTP Presents. I am Farzan Faramarzi, and today my guest is a retired history professor. He used to teach the history of the Holocaust and the history of the Islamic and modern Middle East. He also did some research on Iran's relations with the West, especially with the United States, Great Britain, and France. Missionaries, especially American Presbyterian missionaries in the late Qajar and early Pahlavi Iran. He went to high school in Tehran, the capital of Iran. My guest today is Michael Zirinsky. Welcome to UTP Presents, Mr. Zirinsky.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
So you went to high school in Tehran. How did you end up in Tehran?
My father was an attorney for the United States government, for the Corps of Engineers in New York. And in 1956, he was asked to go to Tehran and to head up the legal shop in the Corps' new office in Tehran.
Okay, so did you learn Farsi or Persian?
I learned enough to get around, but it was all oral. The school I went to was a school for foreigners. It was a school for English-speaking children. It was run by the Presbyterian Mission. It had about 40 different nationalities and people from all over the world, and they chose not to be too close to the Iranian Ministry of Education, and that meant that they were not teaching the Persian language except to those few people who were born in Tehran and were part of the school.
So how would you describe your experience in Tehran or Iran?
Well, it was really a fantastic experience, and for me, a life-changing experience. When I went to Tehran, I was 13 years old. I was also already quite interested in history, and I think that one of the things that I did in Tehran was to cope with my culture shock by reading all the American history I could find. But once I came back to the States to go to college, 4 years later, I found myself in another kind of culture shock, and I began to be really interested in trying to understand what had taken me to Tehran.
After you graduate your college in the United States, did you return to Iran?
I actually did not go back after 1961 until 1997. In 1997, I was asked to participate in a conference on the First World War in Iran that was co-sponsored by the research institutions of both the Iranian and French foreign ministries. And so I went back and spent several weeks in Iran at that time.
So you used to, as I mentioned, you used to teach the history of the Middle East.
Yes.
And you did some research about the Middle East as well. So from your perspective, what is the Middle East and where is the Middle East?
Well, it's a strange term that really came into common usage only after the Second World War. Before that, the region was referred to often as the Near East to distinguish it from the Far East, China and Japan and Southeast Asia. Even before that, there was simply, from the Western perspective, the East. And that meant, especially after the rise of Islam and the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, the various conflicts between the Western states and the Ottomans.
I want to talk about the World War later, but the term, there's a term that usually describes the Middle East, the cradle of civilization.
Right.
What does it mean?
Well, I think that the modern West emerges with the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is a rediscovery by Western Europe of the learning of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. And much of that came from, in fact, the Islamic sources that had preserved it. And it became very clear to these early modern Europeans that civilization really began in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean and somewhat further east. And in particular, as archaeology developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia and the adjacent highlands of Iran.
Okay, so is there any other reasons, like you mentioned before we start the show, you talked about foods.
Yes.
So would you please elaborate on that?
Sure. It seems to me that most of the foodstuffs of the Old World, that is to say before Columbus's voyages to the Western Hemisphere, were first brought into human cultivation in this part of the world. Rice and millet and other grains, which were formerly just gathered, would be cropped as by farming methods. And the same thing is true with the animals of farmers, sheep, cattle, horses. All of these came from the region that we call the cradle of civilization.
So I want to move on and talk about the modern history of the Middle East. When did the history of modern Middle East start?
Well, there are a couple of ways of looking at it. And I think the most long-term way is to look at the Western world's sense of it being in conflict with an East. If Western civilization begins with the Greeks, one of the most important works of history that is preserved from ancient Greece is the history of the Persian Wars by Herodotus, who's often referred to as the father of modern history. And so there's this conflict between East and West long before the rise of Islam. And I think it's accentuated after Islam conquers half of the Christian world in the 7th century of the Christian era, taking all of North Africa and Syria and the regions to the east of that, as well as the Persian civilization, which had been in conflict with Christian Rome. But in modern times, I think it really has to do with the conflict between the Western world and the Ottoman Empire. And when the West expanded to include Russia, it also involved a conflict between Russia and Iran. And so I would say that this is something that begins around the 16th century of the Christian era.
Okay, so the modern history starts from the 16th century from there. So when we are talking about the modern Middle East or the new Middle East, usually people think about like the Freemasons and like the Zionists or the United States. They have like a map or they want to create a new Middle East. Is that true? Or
well, it's interesting that you start with the Freemasons, because the Freemasons are an 18th century Western innovation that has been attacked by conservatives ever since then. There's the sense that the Freemasons caused the French Revolution. And Freemasonry was in the 18th century and in the 19th century something that forward-looking people like George Washington, who was a Freemason, joined so that they would have social and intellectual communication with like-minded people. And in fact, Freemasonry is one of the ways in which modern thinking entered the Islamic world as well, in the Ottoman Empire and in Iran in the 19th century. But those who think of it as a conspiracy, I think, are really totally misunderstanding what's going on. From my point of view as a political historian, is going on is twofold. There's first of all this conflict between the Ottoman Empire, which is a Sunni Muslim state, and the Christian states to the north and west, particularly the Austrians and the Russians. But at the same time that this was going on, the European states were developing their own internal conflicts, and they sought allies wherever they could. And this frequently meant seeking allies in the Islamic world. And so in the 18th century, you have a really fascinating phenomenon of the Europeans allying themselves with each other, with the Ottomans, fighting against other European powers. And in the 19th century, things change because of the Industrial Revolution, the spread of mass literacy in the West, and the development that comes out of this of economic wealth and military power. And so the Islamic world, which had been militarily and politically and culturally much more powerful than the West until the 18th century, suddenly becomes weak. And the Western powers begin a conflict with each other to try to carve up the Islamic world. And in the 19th century, this becomes really a existential problem for both the Ottomans and the Iranians.
So that's a really interesting point, because before that Islamic world, as you mentioned, they had power and they had a lot of things, and basically European tried to work with them and seeking allies in the Islamic world. But after that, it seems that they collapsed and they didn't have anything. They became like a third world countries. Why is that? I mean,
well, I think there are a number of factors going on. One of them clearly is the cultural, intellectual, industrial aspect, where the Islamic powers are really staying still. They're conservative, they're not developing, at the same time that the West is having phenomenal growth. And what is the cause of that? Well, one of the causes is the economic consequences of the discovery of the New World. And so before 1492 and that whole opening of the Atlantic trade, I think it's fair to say that the lands of what we now call the Middle East, what I sometimes refer to as the central lands of Islam, in the Mediterranean and the adjacent areas, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, is the major highway for wealth creation. The Silk Road, of course, is more famous, but I think the seaborne commerce is probably more important. With the opening of the Atlantic world, then you have tremendous wealth being created by the slave trade, by the sugar trade, by the spice trade that goes to the east around Africa, and suddenly the Middle East, which had been very wealthy, turns into a backwater. You can see this in the history of the Mamluks in Egypt. Before 1492, they are a major power, holding the West up to ransom. Once the sea routes to the east are opened up, suddenly all the wealth of the Mamluks disappears, and politically and militarily they cease to exist. The Ottomans conquer Egypt very quickly after that.
Okay, so let's talk about World War II. World War II influenced the Middle East too. So, however, none of the countries in the Middle East were directly involved in the World War II. Would you talk about the role of France and UK in the establishment of Iraq and Syria?
Right. Well, you really have to go back to the First World War, which is a war which, from the European point of view, is a struggle to see what the relationship of Germany would be with the rest of Europe. The Germans, when the war breaks out with Russia and with France, is very much interested in getting the Ottoman Empire into the war on their side, and they succeed in doing so. So in the First World War, there is a Middle Eastern component, which we don't really pay much attention to in the Western world, where we focus on the Western Front and to a lesser extent on the Eastern Front. So, but the Ottomans were a major part of this, and there is major fighting in what we now think of as Palestine and Egypt in particular. And so at the end of the war, the Ottomans collapse completely, and the British and Russia has already collapsed completely. And the British and the French are in a position really to dictate terms to the Islamic world that had been participating in the war. And consequently, they divide up the spoils, as they had first planned to do in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which essentially the British are given continuing control over Egypt, which they had seized in the 1880s. They are given control over Palestine and Iraq. The French are given control over Syria and Lebanon. And in the course of the interwar period, they begin a process of trying to create modern states in these areas. In the Second World War, inevitably, these colonial territories, which were officially known as mandates of the League of Nations, are drawn into the war. And so, although there is not major fighting in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, there is some fighting in these countries. And in Iran, because the government had tilted towards the Germans, in 1941, the British and the Russians invade, overthrow the government, and establish a partition very much like the one that they had created before the First World War, when they divided Iran into spheres of influence with the Russians in the north and the British in the south.
Okay, so as you mentioned, in the First World War, Ottoman Empire was the only country from the Middle East was directly involved in the war.
Yes. Iran, however, was a country which was involved as well. Officially, it was neutral, but the government was so weak that it could not defend its neutrality. The Russians were already in occupation of the north after 1906, 1907, and the Ottomans, in an attempt to seize the Russian Caucasus, which had once been Ottoman territory, invaded Russia through Iran. And so Iran, especially in the northwest, became a battlefield of the war and suffered enormous casualties, mostly because of famine that was set off by the war and disease which was spread by the war.
Since we are talking about war, from the historian perspective, why is there so much war in the Middle East? I mean, still we have wars.
Right. Well, I don't think there's any more war in the Middle East than any other part of the world. I think it is one of the very sad things about the human race is that we have a long history of doing our best to kill each other, and sometimes we're terribly efficient at this, as the Second World War was, with some 60 million people killed in the course of the war. Most of those in Eastern Europe by the Germans. The enormous casualties are suffered by the Russians and the Poles. 6 million Poles out of a total population of 33 million were killed in the war. And the Soviet mortality is almost that great as a percentage, and much higher in terms of numbers.
Okay. So back to Iran, do you think Reza Shah was the father of modern Iran?
Absolutely. The Qajar dynasty was a very traditional Islamic dynasty. It was able to maintain itself by a process of divide and rule that perhaps was very typical of pre-modern societies everywhere. And it was isolated from the military developments of the 19th century, in part because of its diplomacy, which was very effective at balancing the Ottomans against the Russians against the British, and so forth. But in the First World War, the state essentially collapsed as these foreign armies went at will all over the country. And what happened after the war is that all the foreign powers except Great Britain disappeared. The Germans lost the war, the Russians collapsed in revolution, the French had little influence there, the Ottomans ceased to exist, the British were there alone, but the British were bankrupt. And essentially what happened was the Treasury said, you've got to pull the army out of Iran, and so what's going to happen? And Reza Khan, then a colonel or perhaps a brigadier general in the Cossack division, which had been established by the Russians as their instrument, but the Russians were no longer there, led a coup d'etat in 1921 with the support of the British and ultimately the Soviets as well, and was able in a very short time to reestablish a strong Iranian state. And between the 1921 coup and his overthrow by the British and Russians in 1941, he created all the modern institutions of a state which still continue in the form of the Islamic Republic.
So after Reza Shah, as you mentioned, British helped him to gain power.
Yes.
And then actually they helped the opposite side to overthrow Reza Shah,
Right.
and he never forgives them. So after him, his son gained power and became the next king of and last king of Iran.
Right.
So if you want to mention three historical mistakes of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, what are they?
Well, I want to back up a little bit. There are many mistakes, and I've boiled them down to three. But I think that you have to go to experience and personality as well. Reza Shah was, by training, a military officer. He went into the Cossack brigade, as it then was, as a teenager, and because of his strength and intelligence, he rose to the very top. He had very little education. Many people say he was barely literate, and that most of his reading and writing he learned as an adult. But he was someone who was a very strong character, and one of the cliches about him is that he was a man that no one could lie to. And everyone had to tell the truth. His son, on the other hand, grew up in a royal household as everyone knew he was going to become Shah. Everyone deferred to him in the process of growing up. He didn't have to seize his own position. And judging by what I've read, mostly in the British archives, he seems to have been a very weak character. In any case, when he became king, he increasingly became the sort of man that no one would tell the truth to if the truth was bad and unhappy. So he was a man who was, for various reasons, I think, isolated from the truth in ways that his father never was. And so I would say that his three biggest mistakes, if I can boil it down to that, were, first of all, his disregard for the Constitution. In the weakness before the First World War, Iran had had the first revolution in the Third World, as we now call it. And this revolution provided for the establishment of a national consultative assembly, the Majlis, and it provided a framework for government that was intended to be both Islamic on the one hand and liberal in the sense that the Belgian constitution was liberal, in which there would be universal suffrage, in which there would be representatives elected, and in which the king, the Qajar king in 1906, when the constitution was elaborated, would reign but not rule. And Mohammad Reza Shah ultimately was a man who insisted on ruling. He did not obey the spirit of the Constitution, which said that he should defer to the elected representatives of the people. So I think that this was a serious problem. And clearly it got worse after the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in the context of the Cold War. And so after 1953, I think his greatest problem was his inability to come to terms with the clergy, with the leaders of Islamic opinion. And this is, of course, always a very difficult thing to do because Islam has a long tradition of there being official Islamic leaders and popular Islamic leaders. And in Iran especially, the popular Islamic leaders were much more important than the official Islamic leaders. But I think he really lost the plot in the late 1970s when he decided that the calendar, which had always been based on the Islamic notion of the beginning of time being at the moment when the Prophet Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina and established the Ummah as an organization for Islamic society. He changed the constitution, the calendar from a Hijri calendar to a calendar based presumably on the establishment of the Persian monarchy. And this, I think, meant to all Muslims, whether they were pro-Pahlavi or not, it meant that he was no longer really paying attention to the Islamic fundamentals, which were so important to 95% or more of the Iranian population. The third thing that I think is most important is that In the context of the 1970s, he first of all provoked the rise in oil prices, which triggered an enormous crisis in the entire world by raising the cost of virtually everything. And in Iran, this had the unfortunate effect of setting off not prosperity, which he wanted, but enormous inflation. And the particular moment comes in about 1977, I don't remember the exact date, when he called a conference of all the members of the Plan Organization and instructed them, against the advice of the economists, to double the growth that was planned from 5% per year to 10% per year. And this set off a massive inflation that is one of the causes of the revolution that broke out in 1978.
Okay, so you mentioned about Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, one of the nationalist prime minister of Iran,
right.
and the Cold War. So some historians believe Cold War started from March 1946 when Soviets announced withdrawal from Iran. Do you agree with that date?
Yes and no. And you're referring really to the end of the so-called Azerbaijan crisis, in which the Soviets failed to do as they had promised to do in the tripartite treaty that was negotiated between Britain, Russia, and Iran after the invasion in 1941, that all foreign troops would be withdrawn within 6 months of the end of the war. The Russians failed to do that. And this set off a crisis because while the Russians were occupying the north, two republics established themselves, one in Azerbaijan, one in Kurdistan, and this is often seen as Stalin's first aggression after the Second World War and a spark for the Cold War. But I think it's important to understand that the Cold War is really a continuation of other conflicts. And in particular, it is a continuation of the conflict between communism in the form that it took under Lenin and later Stalin, and the Western world, which sometimes thought of itself as capitalist, sometimes didn't. And this in turn is a continuation of a much older conflict between the British and the Russians, which in the Middle East takes the form of what is known in the history of the British Empire as the Great Game in Asia, in which Britain and Russia are trying to take over territories to the north of India, and in which the British fear that the Russians are seeking a warm water port, which means coming down to the Persian Gulf and taking all of Iran, which the British resisted because of the importance to the British state of the Indian Empire.
Okay, I have more questions. I'm really enjoying talking to you about the history. Is there anything else you want to add?
I'm going to say no, because I just go on, and I think that this is, I've said enough. All of these questions could be developed at great length, and I've done this in classes, and historians do it, and I suppose there's one thing that's clear about historians is that you make careers by disagreeing with the people who have come before you, and so it's a never-ending process.
Never-ending process. Okay, well, thanks for joining us for today.
Pleasure.
That's all the time we have today. I want to thank Mr. Zirinsky for joining us. I am Farzan Faramarzi, and until next time, have a wonderful day.